The man who got me fired after 12 years of loyalty eventually ended up losing everything. His job, his marriage, his reputation, even his freedom. The strange part is that I didn't cause any of it. A few years earlier, I probably would have spent a lot of time imagining ways to get even with him. After all, he was the reason I lost a career I had spent more than a decade building. But life has a funny way of dealing with people like Ken, and I learned that one afternoon when an old coworker called me with news I never expected to hear. As he explained what had happened, I just sat there in complete silence. The man who had convinced an entire company that I was the problem had finally run out of people to blame. But to explain why that phone call meant so much to me, I have to go back several years to the job I honestly believed I would retire from. I worked for a large retail company for a little over 12 years. I was never a manager, and I never had a fancy title. Most customers probably didn't even know my name. But inside the store, almost everyone depended on me. If inventory numbers didn't add up, people came to me. If a shipment disappeared, people came to me. If a new employee couldn't figure something out, they came to me. Over the years, I learned every corner of the operation. I knew the delivery schedules better than some supervisors. I knew the inventory systems so well that I could often spot mistakes before the computer did. I knew which vendors always caused problems, which procedures actually worked, and which shortcuts usually created even bigger headaches later on. I wasn't important because of my job title. I was important because of experience, and for a long time, that experience was respected. The store wasn't perfect. No workplace ever is. People complained about schedules, customers occasionally lost their tempers, and corporate made decisions that nobody seemed to understand. But overall, it was a good place to work. Most employees stayed for years, managers came and went, and the culture remained relatively stable. People helped each other, and when problems came up, we solved them together. I genuinely believed I would spend the rest of my career there. Looking back now, that was probably my first mistake. I had tied too much of my identity to a company. At the time, though, I didn't see it that way. I simply believed loyalty mattered. One thing I always took pride in was helping new employees. Every few months we would hire someone new, and almost all of them were overwhelmed during those first few weeks. The systems were complicated, the inventory process had a steep learning curve, and customers always seemed to save their hardest questions for the newest person on the floor. So I helped. Not because anyone told me to, but because I remembered exactly what it felt like to be new. Over the years, there were employees who had been trained almost entirely by me. Some eventually became supervisors, and a few even worked their way into management positions. That never bothered me. I wasn't interested in climbing the corporate ladder anymore. I liked what I did, I liked being good at it, and I liked being someone people could rely on. That reputation followed me for years. If a manager didn't know how to solve a problem, they would often ask me. If another department ran into trouble, someone usually called me. It became normal, almost expected, which was why nobody thought much of it when corporate announced that we were getting a new store manager. Managers changed all the time. Most stayed for a few years before moving on somewhere else. We all assumed this one would be no different. Then Ken arrived. At first, everyone liked him. Honestly, that included me. He looked exactly like the kind of manager corporate executives love. He always wore a perfect suit, had a confident handshake, and knew exactly how to present himself. The guy could walk into a room and sound like he had all the answers. During his first staff meeting, he talked about improving efficiency, strengthening workplace culture, and creating opportunities for growth. People were impressed. I was impressed. For the first few weeks, I honestly thought we had gotten lucky. Ken seemed energetic, motivated, and focused. He spent time learning how the operation worked, asked thoughtful questions, walked through every department, and made an effort to introduce himself to everyone. If someone had told me back then that he would eventually destroy the entire atmosphere of the store, I probably would have laughed. But then little things started happening. They were small enough that most people ignored them. One afternoon, a newer employee came to me with a problem involving inventory counts. I helped her fix it in less than 5 minutes, and as we were wrapping up, I happened to glance across the department and notice Ken watching us. He wasn't smiling. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Then it happened again. And again. Employees kept coming to me for help, not because I encouraged it, but because they trusted me. I had been there for years, and I knew how things worked. The strange part was the way Ken reacted. Every time someone came to me with a question or asked for my help, I could almost feel him paying attention, watching, evaluating. At first, his reactions were subtle. A certain look, a random comment, a slightly irritated tone in his voice. Nothing serious, nothing you could really point to and say, "See? That's the problem." But it was there. One day, during a team meeting, one of the employees thanked me for helping solve a shipment issue that had nearly delayed an entire delivery. The room laughed, and it was completely harmless, just someone showing a little appreciation. Ken smiled too, but something about it looked forced. Then he made a comment I've never forgotten. "Well," he said with a chuckle, "let's make sure everyone remembers who management is." A few people laughed awkwardly, and the meeting moved on, but I remember sitting there feeling strangely uncomfortable. It was such an odd thing to say, especially after a simple compliment directed at another employee. Looking back, that was the first moment I realized something wasn't right. Not necessarily because of what he said, but because of why he said it. Ken didn't seem bothered when people made mistakes. He seemed bothered when other people received respect, especially me. At the time, I convinced myself I was imagining things. I figured he was still adjusting to a new environment, learning everyone's personalities, and trying to establish himself as the new leader. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. A lot of us did. That would turn out to be another mistake. Over the next several months, those little warning signs slowly grew into something much bigger, and once Ken decided that I was a threat, he started using the only thing he truly cared about, his authority. The first change seemed minor enough: my schedule. For years, my shifts had been relatively consistent, not because I received special treatment, but because it made operational sense. I handled responsibilities that benefited from continuity, and previous managers understood that. Ken either didn't understand it, or maybe he understood it perfectly, and that was exactly why he changed it. Suddenly, I would open one day, close the next, and then be expected to open again less than 12 hours later. My schedule looked like it had been designed by someone throwing darts at a board. I was exhausted, and everyone around me noticed it. When I finally asked Ken what was going on, he gave me the exact same answer every single time. Business needs. That was it. No explanation, no conversation, just 2 words. At first, I tried to work around it. I told myself it was probably temporary. Maybe he was experimenting with staffing, or maybe there was a legitimate operational reason behind the changes. But after a while, I noticed something that I couldn't ignore. Nobody else's schedule was changing like mine. Just mine. And that was the moment I started wondering whether all those strange looks and subtle reactions I had been getting for months weren't so harmless after all. Unfortunately, the scheduling problems were only the beginning. The real trouble hadn't even started yet. At first, I convinced myself that the scheduling changes were nothing more than poor management. Maybe Ken was still adjusting. Maybe he was experimenting with new systems. But then the blame started, and that was when I realized it had become personal. One week, a shipment arrived late because of a transportation issue that was completely outside of our control. The trucking company had already notified us about the delay, and everyone in the store knew exactly what had happened. Somehow, during a management meeting, Ken still found a way to connect the problem to me, not directly, not at first. He was smarter than that. Instead, he would make comments like, "Communication could have been better," while looking straight in my direction. Other times he would say things such as, "Some long-term employees have become too comfortable with old processes," and once again, his eyes would land on me. The first few times it happened, I ignored it. I figured I was reading too much into it, but eventually I started noticing a pattern. Whenever something went wrong, no matter how unrelated it was to my actual responsibilities, Ken found a way to bring my name into the conversation. If there was an inventory issue, Michael should have caught it. If there was a customer complaint, Michael hadn't communicated properly. If a new employee made a mistake, Michael wasn't doing enough to support the team. Most of the accusations didn't even make sense, but that wasn't really the point. The point was repetition. Ken wasn't trying to solve problems, he was creating a story, and the more often people hear the same story, the easier it becomes for them to believe it. The most frustrating part was that many of the issues he blamed on other people were actually the direct result of his own decisions. He constantly changed procedures, ignored advice from experienced employees, and implemented new systems he barely understood. Then, when those ideas inevitably failed, he looked for someone else to blame. At the same time, he became a completely different person whenever anyone from corporate visited the store. I watched it happen over and over again. A district manager would walk through the front doors, and suddenly Ken would transform. His voice changed. His attitude changed. Even his personality seemed different. He became friendly, supportive, and professional. The exact kind of leader corporate executives love to see. Then the visit would end, the executive would leave, and within an hour he would be criticizing employees all over again. I remember one afternoon when I saw it happen almost instantly. A district manager had just spent half an hour praising the teamwork in our store, complimenting the way everyone seemed willing to help each other. Ken stood there smiling through the entire conversation. The moment the manager walked out, he turned toward one of our department supervisors and started criticizing her in front of everyone. The room went completely silent. That was the first time I saw genuine fear in some of my coworkers. Not frustration, not annoyance, fear. By then, everyone understood something important. Ken didn't just dislike criticism. He needed someone else to blame. And if he decided that person was you, your work life became significantly harder. Little by little, the atmosphere in the store started changing. People stopped speaking honestly during meetings. Employees became careful about every word they said. Conversations would suddenly end whenever Ken walked into the room. The entire workplace felt heavier, more tense, and far less trusting than it had ever been before. Then people started leaving. One by one, some of our best employees resigned. These weren't new hires or people looking for an excuse to quit. They were experienced employees who had been with the company for years and knew the operation inside and out. Every time someone left, Ken acted as though it wasn't a loss. Sometimes he even suggested it was a good thing, talking about how the company needed fresh energy. What he really meant was that he preferred employees who didn't know enough to challenge him. The replacements rarely lasted long. Turnover increased, training became more difficult, workloads grew heavier, and morale dropped across the entire store. Somehow, according to Ken, all of that was evidence that long-term employees like me were simply resisting change. The accusation was ridiculous. Over 12 years, I had adapted to countless changes. New systems, new procedures, and new management teams. I wasn't resisting change. I was resisting bad decisions. There's a difference, whether Ken couldn't see it or simply refused to acknowledge it. Around that same time, rumors started circulating around the store. At first, they sounded like ordinary workplace gossip. Someone claimed they had seen Ken at a casino. Someone else said he was carrying a lot of personal debt. Another employee mentioned hearing that he had financial problems at his previous job. I ignored most of it. Retail stores generate rumors the same way restaurants generate dirty dishes, constantly. Most of them turn out to be nonsense. But after a while, the stories became too consistent to completely dismiss. Different employees, who rarely talked to one another, kept repeating the same details. Heavy gambling, constant debt, money problems. None of it ever reached corporate leadership, at least not officially, but inside the store people talked about it quietly and carefully. The more I heard, the more certain things about Ken started to make sense, especially his obsession with control and his desperation to protect the image he had built for himself. Still, I had no proof, just suspicions. Then the inventory problem started. Gift cards occasionally went missing. Certain pieces of merchandise couldn't be accounted for. Inventory discrepancies began showing up more frequently. At first, the amounts were small enough that each incident could be explained away on its own, but taken together they formed a pattern. The strange thing was that every time questions came up, Ken already seemed to have an explanation ready. Sometimes he seemed a little too ready, and somehow, suspicion always landed on someone else. Never on him. I remember one young employee losing his job after being blamed for inventory issues. The kid was devastated. He swore he hadn't done anything wrong, and honestly, most of us believed him. But Ken had already prepared the paperwork, reports, notes, documentation, a neat little paper trail that made the decision look justified. Within a few weeks, that employee was gone. Looking back, I sometimes wonder how many people paid the price for mistakes Ken himself had been making. At the time, I didn't know the answer. I only knew that something felt deeply wrong, and the longer I worked under him, the more obvious it became. Eventually, corporate started noticing that things were changing too. The store's performance was slipping. Customer complaints were increasing. Employee turnover had become impossible to ignore, and operational problems kept piling up. Even people outside the building could see that something wasn't working. Then one day we got the news that corporate was launching an investigation. I still remember hearing that announcement. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long while. Relief. Real relief. I honestly believed the nightmare might finally be ending. I thought corporate had finally seen what everyone else could already see. That should have been the moment everything started getting better. Instead, it became the moment everything fell apart. Over the next several weeks, investigators came to the store. They interviewed employees, reviewed reports, asked questions, and observed daily operations. On the surface, the process looked serious, and I'll admit I felt hopeful. For months I had watched good people suffer while Ken manipulated situations and avoided accountability. Finally, someone was paying attention. I genuinely believed the truth would speak for itself. I was wrong. The first warning sign came when I started talking to my coworkers about the investigation. Most of them were terrified. People who had spent months complaining privately suddenly became quiet. Some refused to say much during their interviews. Others gave vague, careful answers. A few admitted outright that they were afraid of retaliation. Even during an investigation, Ken still had power, and nobody knew what would happen once it was over. Sarah was one of the few employees willing to speak honestly with me. She had been with the company for years and had seen everything that had happened. One afternoon she quietly pulled me aside and said, "I hope they actually listen this time." The way she said it bothered me. She didn't sound hopeful. She sounded worried. Deep down, she wasn't sure the truth would matter. To be honest, neither was I. Still, when it was finally my turn to be interviewed, I made a decision. I was going to tell the truth, all of it. I knew there was risk. I knew Ken wouldn't appreciate it, but I honestly believed it was the best chance the store had to get better. So I explained everything. The scheduling issues, the favoritism, the constant blame shifting, the employee turnover, the toxic atmosphere, and the culture of fear that had spread throughout the workplace. I didn't exaggerate anything, and I didn't make personal attacks. I simply described what I had seen and experienced. When the interview ended, I walked out feeling strangely optimistic. For the first time in months, I thought maybe things were finally going to change. Then I learned something that made my stomach drop. Ken wasn't facing the investigation alone. Over the months he had been in charge, he had built a very close relationship with the district manager who had hired him, close enough that his version of events carried enormous weight. And while I had spent all that time trying to keep the store running, Ken had been quietly building a case against me. Every minor disagreement, every complaint, every little mistake, every time I questioned one of his decisions, he had documented it all, not objectively, but strategically. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. I had been treating the situation like a workplace problem that could be solved with honesty and evidence. Ken had been treating it like a political battle, and he had been preparing for it for a very long time. For the first time, I started wondering whether the outcome of the investigation had already been decided before it had even begun. A few weeks later, I got my answer. I was called into a meeting. Ken was there. The district manager was there. Human resources was there. The moment I walked into the room, something felt wrong. Nobody looked surprised to see me. Nobody looked uncertain. Their expressions looked rehearsed, almost like everyone already knew exactly how the conversation was going to end. I sat down, and they immediately started talking about performance concerns. My performance concerns. For a few seconds, I honestly thought there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Then they continued. According to them, I resisted change. I undermined management. I contributed to negativity in the workplace. I sat there listening to accusations that sounded less like descriptions of me and more like descriptions of Ken himself. 12 years. 12 years of positive evaluations. 12 years of solving problems. 12 years of helping train employees, supporting managers, and doing everything I could to keep the store running. And somehow, none of it mattered. The story Ken had spent months creating was winning. I remember looking around the room and realizing that nobody was actually asking questions. Nobody wanted to hear my side of the story. Nobody was interested in an explanation. The decision had already been made before I walked through the door. I wasn't sitting in a meeting. I was sitting through a formality. Then came the words I never imagined I would hear. My employment was being terminated. Just like that, 12 years of loyalty were reduced to a few carefully worded corporate sentences. At first, I didn't even feel angry. I just felt numb. I signed the paperwork, gathered my things, and walked through the building one final time. Some people avoided eye contact. Some looked shocked. Others looked genuinely heartbroken. A few quietly told me they were sorry, and I thanked them before continuing toward the exit. I still remember standing alone in the parking lot afterward, looking back at the building where I had spent more than a decade of my life. The building I thought I would retire from. The building I had helped keep running through countless problems and management changes. And suddenly, I wasn't part of it anymore. I sat in my truck for a long time before starting the engine. Not because I didn't know where to go, but because I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I had spent so many years defining myself through that job that losing it felt like losing a part of my identity. What I didn't realize then was that getting fired wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a completely different one. And while I sat there in that parking lot wondering how I was ever going to rebuild my life, the people who had chosen Ken over the truth were about to discover exactly how much they had really lost. For the first few weeks after losing my job, I felt like I was drifting through life. Every morning, I would wake up at the same time I had for years, and for a brief moment everything felt normal. Then reality would hit. I didn't have anywhere to go, no schedule to follow, no store waiting for me, no employees asking for help. The career I had spent 12 years building was simply gone. No matter how many times I replayed the investigation in my head, no matter how many different ways I imagined those meetings could have gone, the outcome never changed. The financial stress only made things worse. I had some savings, but not enough to stay unemployed forever. Every expense suddenly seemed larger than it used to. Every bill felt heavier. Friends and family encouraged me to apply for another retail management position somewhere else, but the truth was that I didn't want one. After everything I had been through, I couldn't imagine walking back into another workplace where politics mattered more than competence. For months, I had watched loyalty get punished while manipulation got rewarded, and I had no interest in putting myself through that again. Still, I couldn't just sit around doing nothing. I had a family depending on me, and eventually I started thinking about a small side project I had experimented with years earlier. It wasn't anything special, just a small manufacturing idea I had worked on during weekends for fun. It had never made much money, and I had never taken it seriously, but it was something I understood. More importantly, it was something I controlled. After everything that had happened, the idea of being in control of my own work again sounded better than anything else. So I cleared out part of my garage, bought a few pieces of equipment, and invested money that I probably should have been saving. Then I got to work. The first few months were rough. Really rough. There were days when I questioned whether I had made a terrible mistake. Days when I looked at my numbers and realized I had earned less in a week than I used to make in a single day at the store. It was discouraging, and more than once I wondered if I should just swallow my pride and try to get another corporate job. But there was one thing that kept me going. Unlike my old workplace, every success belonged to me. Every failure belonged to me too. There were no politics, no manipulative managers, no one taking credit for my work, and no one looking for a scapegoat when things went wrong. It was just effort and results. Slowly, things started getting better. 1 customer became 3. 3 became 10. 10 became 20. Before long, referrals started coming in, and word of mouth began doing the marketing for me. People appreciated the quality of my work, and I realized something important. The skills that had made me valuable at the retail company hadn't disappeared when I lost my job. The attention to detail, the organization, the ability to solve problems and build systems, they were still there. The only difference was that I had spent 12 years using those skills to build someone else's business. Now I was finally using them to build my own future. Around the same time, I started hearing updates from some of my former coworkers. The first reports were almost predictable. The store was struggling, and not just a little. Inventory problems were becoming more common, training quality had dropped, new employees weren't staying very long, and departments that used to run smoothly were constantly falling behind. At first, I tried not to feel any satisfaction. I genuinely cared about many of the people who still work there, and I didn't want to see them suffer. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a certain sense of validation in hearing those stories. For years, I had been made to feel like I wasn't important. For years, Ken had convinced people that I was the problem. Now the store itself was proving otherwise. One former coworker called me after an especially chaotic week and said, "You wouldn't believe what's happening here." The truth was, I probably would. Most of the issues she described were exactly the problems I had spent years warning people about. The only difference now was that nobody had my experience to rely on anymore. One by one, the experienced employees continued leaving. Some quit voluntarily. Others transferred to different locations. The knowledge drain became impossible to ignore, and the foundation that had kept the store running for years was slowly crumbling. Ken had pushed out so many capable people that eventually he was left surrounded by employees he had personally chosen, and suddenly there was no one else left to blame. You would think that would have exposed him. It should have. But somehow, Ken managed to survive a little longer. Then, about a year after I left, I heard about the incident that finally started turning people against him. During a staff meeting, Ken made an openly racist remark toward one of the employees. This time, things unfolded differently. The employee filed a formal complaint, and instead of staying quiet, another employee backed it up. Then another. Then another. Suddenly, the company couldn't ignore what had happened. Too many people had witnessed it, and too many were finally willing to speak up. For the first time, Ken's usual tactics weren't enough to save him. Corporate gave him a choice: resign voluntarily or be terminated. He resigned. When I heard the news, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, what I felt was relief. Not revenge. Not satisfaction. Just relief. The people who still worked there finally had a chance to move forward without him hanging over every conversation and every decision. At the time, I assumed that was the end of Ken's story. I was wrong. The years passed, and my own life kept improving. The garage workshop eventually became a real workshop. The workshop grew into a small facility. I hired my first employee, then another, and eventually a small team began to form around the business I had built from scratch. One of the strangest moments came when I realized I had accidentally created the kind of workplace I had always wanted to work in myself. People were treated with respect. Problems were discussed openly instead of hidden. Experience was valued. Nobody had to be afraid of speaking honestly. The irony wasn't lost on me. The company that fired me had unknowingly pushed me towards something far better than I ever would have found if I had stayed. One day, while catching up with an old coworker, I learned that Ken had landed another management position. Apparently, someone he knew had helped him get the job. My first reaction was disbelief. My second was concern, not for him, but for the employees who were about to work under him. I had seen this movie before, and I knew exactly how it ended. At first, everything followed the same familiar pattern. Ken made a great first impression. Corporate loved him. Employees were cautiously optimistic. But eventually his real personality started showing through again. The arrogance returned. The blame-shifting returned. The manipulation returned. And according to people who knew him, the gambling problem never really went away. If anything, it had only gotten worse. The debts kept growing, the pressure kept building, and eventually Ken reached the point he always seemed to reach: desperation. The difference was that this new company wasn't the same as the old one. Their financial controls were stricter, their security systems were better, and they had far less tolerance for missing money. According to what I later heard, the thefts started small. A little cash here, a little cash there, just enough that Ken thought nobody would notice. The problem was that eventually, someone did. An internal audit was launched. Missing funds were identified. And unlike my old employer, this company actually investigated aggressively. Security footage was reviewed. Financial records were examined. Timelines were compared. The truth surfaced quickly, and for the first time in a long time, Ken had nowhere left to hide. There was no innocent employee to sacrifice, no convenient scapegoat to blame, and no carefully crafted narrative to protect him. There was only evidence. Clear, undeniable evidence. The kind that doesn't care how charismatic you are. The kind that doesn't care who your friends are. The kind that doesn't care how many excuses you've prepared. The security footage showed everything. Ken had been stealing money from the company safe, and he had been caught. Once the authorities became involved, everything escalated quickly. Criminal charges followed, and the management career he had spent years trying to protect disappeared almost overnight. The reputation he had carefully manipulated people into believing collapsed completely, and unlike before, he couldn't talk his way out of it. Then came the personal consequences. His wife, Lisa, finally left him. After years of debt, lies, and broken promises, she had simply had enough. Family members distanced themselves. Friends stopped answering his calls. The people who had once defended him quietly disappeared from his life. One piece at a time, the world he had spent years building came apart. The strangest part of all of this was that I didn't even learn about it right away. By then, I was busy running my own company, busy building a life I genuinely enjoyed. Ken had become someone I rarely thought about anymore. Then one afternoon, years after I had been fired, my phone rang. It was James, an old coworker I still talk to every once in a while. We spent a few minutes catching up, and then he asked if I had heard about Ken. I told him I hadn't. There was a brief pause before he started telling me everything. The theft, the arrest, the divorce, the complete collapse of the life Ken had spent years trying to protect. When James finished, I just sat there quietly for a moment, not because I was happy, because I felt something I never expected to feel. Nothing. No anger. No bitterness. No urge to celebrate. The emotions I had carried after losing my job had disappeared long ago. What remained was perspective. By that point, my own life was already better than it had ever been. I owned a successful business. I worked alongside people I respected. I controlled my own future. I no longer depended on the approval of managers or executives. And, perhaps most importantly, I was genuinely happy, something I hadn't even realized was missing while I was working under Ken. After the call ended, I found myself thinking back to the day I walked out of that store for the very last time. At the time, it had felt like the worst day of my professional life, the end of everything I had worked for, the ultimate betrayal. But life rarely looks the same when you look back on it years later. What felt like a disaster turned out to be a turning point. What felt like a defeat became an opportunity. And the man who had spent years trying to destroy my career ultimately destroyed his own. Not because I got revenge. Not because I exposed him. Not because I fought back. But because eventually, the truth catches up to people. Especially the ones who spend their entire lives trying to run from it. If there's one thing I learned from everything that happened, it's this: never tie your worth to a company. Work hard. Be loyal. Help people. But understand that your value doesn't come from a job title or an employer's approval. It comes from what you're capable of building when everything falls apart. Losing that job felt like the end of my story. It wasn't. It was the beginning of a much better one. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't watching someone fail. It's realizing that you no longer need them to.